and we're on Mission Impossible 2. This one's an interesting one. This is an interesting movie. It sits in an interesting place in the collection. So I'm looking forward to breaking this down a little bit. But we'll start out by giving the basic stats of the movie. Mission Impossible 2 came out May 24th, 2000. So this was 4 years after the original Mission Impossible movie. It had a budget of $125 million. Its opening weekend in the box office, it did $57.8 million. Domestically, it ran a total of $215 million domestically and made $546 million globally. It was also the highest grossing film of 2000, which is really interesting. It came out the same month as Gladiator. So highest grossing movie of the year 2000, and is in fact the only one of the series to be the highest grossing movie of that particular year. Now, some of that's circumstance, but it is interesting, especially because what's interesting about this movie is it tends to be the most panned one, both by fans and by general movie critics. So just a little bit of an update here. The cast and director, the director of this one was John Woo. The writers were Ronald Moore and Brandon Braga. Now, Ronald Moore and Brandon Braga are very well known to me because they were the showrunners on a lot of the Star Trek stuff. They were involved heavily in Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. I think some in Voyager too. They also wrote, they were heavily involved in writing some of the Star Trek Next Generation movies, Generations, First Contact, and that line. So these guys are well known to me. In fact, I did not even realize they were involved in this project. And so then the main cast, of course, you have Tom Cruise returning as Ethan Hunt. You have Tandy Newton as the character Nia Nordorf Hall. Fun fact about this, it was actually Nicole Kidman, who was still married to Tom Cruise at the time, who suggested Tandy Newton for this role. And then the writers actually ended up writing a lot of the character around her because they had her on board. Dougray Scott played Sean Ambrose in this movie. Fun fact about this, because of the production overruns and how long it took them to film it, he had to back out of playing Wolverine in the X-Men. Can you imagine? Because Wolverine kind of made Hugh Jackman.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if that had been Dougray Scott instead of Hugh Jackman? Would Dougray Scott have the same level of clout that Hugh Jackman now does?
I don't know.
Because I have not seen this guy in almost anything other than this.
Yeah.
It's fascinating what if scenario there. Ving Rhames and John Polson played the character of Billy. In my mind, this is one of the least memorable characters in all of the Mission Impossible movies. Fun fact here, it was originally cast to be Steve Zahn. But then when delays happened, Steve Zahn had to back out of this one. So Steve Zahn, basically in Simon Pegg, basically played a similar role. So had Steve Zahn in there, would we have Simon Pegg later in the series? Interesting. So those are your main cast. Basic plot for the movie. IMF agent Ethan Hunt is sent to Sydney to find and destroy a genetically modified disease called Chimera. Basically, what happens is right from the beginning of the movie, you see the bad guys. They take a plane down. They think they have got this virus with them, and they're going to use it to blackmail the company that made it. In order to deal with this, IMF sends Tom Cruise, Ethan Hunt, to recruit Nia Nordorf Hall. He thinks to recruit her for her skills as a thief. In the meantime, he falls for her as he's recruiting her, only to be told that her job is to go back and resume a relationship with her ex-boyfriend, who is Sean Ambrose, who was the one who jacked the plane and stole the virus. From that point, they play a cat and mouse game back and forth between Ambrose and Hunt. Ambrose was a former IMF agent, or actually a current IMF agent that's gone rogue. And the character of Nia gets caught in the middle constantly between the two of them. And finally, they face off in a contest over the virus and the cure. And the plot line for Naya's character and the plot line for this movie is loosely based on the Hitchcock film Notorious, which actually at one point right after the movie came out, there was a column from the LA Times where they were basically calling him out for it, and then the guy who came in and finished up the screenplay wrote back and disputed all of it. But there's no doubt, like they admit that they based some of it off the Hitchcock film Notorious. All right, Rob. So general observations. What are some observations from Mission Impossible 2?
So this is not really a word, but I've heard it used to describe certain soccer performances in the past. So to me, Mission Impossible 2 is an absolute disaster class of a movie.
All right, that's going to need more explanation. We got to unpack that.
Yeah, I mean, there just seems a whole lot in the movie that's ham-fisted to me. The constant switching of the face masks to show us who's being who.
Yeah,
like let the audience figure that out at some point. You don't have to show us every single time. Like some of it just seems obvious. Like we should know what's happening.
That's one of the things that stands out most to people: the constant mask switching. Yeah,
and I know John Woo, but the doves everywhere, especially in the evil guy's facility. Like apparently underground, there's just like this huge colony of doves just living in their building. They just they just chill with.
Why not, man?
The whole plot line of forcing her to go back with her ex-boyfriend who like rapes her. She doesn't have
samurai
according to her own volition, really. Like it's really disturbing. What they make the character do. And
it definitely builds a tension into the storyline, but is that really the best way to do that?
I just I don't find a lot redeemable about this movie. It's just I have to rewatch all of them still, but from my recollections, like this by far is the worst one for me of the series.
One question I forgot: when did you first see this film?
I think I saw it I don't think I saw this one in the theater either. I think it was like a year or so after it came out.
I saw this one in theaters, I think on opening weekend, because in the interim I'd become a big fan of the previous movie. Came out right before I graduated, like less than a month before I graduated. So I do remember being in the theaters watching it. So we'll get to some more specific strengths and weaknesses in a moment. Any other specific observations?
Not really.
Okay. One thing that stands out to me is this is by far the most localized Mission Impossible film. There's a brief shot at the beginning of him rock climbing, and they filmed that in Utah, but like they don't really tell you where that place is in the movie. There's a scene in Seville where he's recruiting Naya, and then the rest of it is all in Australia. That's very, very different than any of the other Mission Impossible movies. It's very heavily based in Australia. So the world traveling all over the place thing that become a hallmark of the film is really not present in this film, which is another thing that makes it unique and different. Lots of slow-mo. Lots of slow-mo in this, and I'll talk about this when I talk about one of the things I like about this movie. But yeah, there's lots of slow-mo scenes interspersed throughout, usually when characters are interacting for the first time. So that's often done. It has much warmer tones than most of the other ones. There's lots of oranges, reds, as opposed to a lot of cold light in the original. So that was intentional by John Woo. He wanted to make a warmer film, and he certainly succeeded in that. It's definitely color-wise, tone-wise, it's a lot warmer.
Maybe you should have set it on fire. Warm.
Indeed. What's interesting about this is I don't know if there's a bigger contrast in styles between Mission Impossible and Mission Impossible 2 throughout the entire film. And you could say maybe from 2 to 3 also, but that kind of just anchors the fact that 2 is unique and different. It's up in the air to me as to which one is the most unique, this one or the original Mission Impossible. But they're both very, very different films. And this was intentional. Tom Cruise, at this point in the series, he basically told John Woo, he said, I want each episode of this series to look and feel entirely different. Kind of like you're directing, this is this director's version, this is this director's version. At the time, that was what he wanted. He didn't want a remake of the exact same feel for the first one. So that's what John Woo did. And it definitely has John Woo style to it. It's also definitely widely regarded as most people's least favorite Mission Impossible film. Now, there are some people that would say 3, but I would say if 90% of people, if you ask them to rank them who are fans of it, this one's going to be their least favorite. I tend to be more of a defender of this. Not that I don't agree with the criticism, but among my friend group, I've had many conversations where the hate raining down on this movie is severe, and I'm the one standing there like trying to hold it up a little bit. So I don't hate this movie as much as others do, but I absolutely understand the weaknesses of the film. Strengths. What is there anything you liked about the film? Anything that stood out to you? Anything you enjoyed?
I don't know if you mentioned his name in the rundown of the characters, but Brendan Gleeson's
I did not.
Character as kind of the man in the shadows behind everything. I think he does a good job of playing that, because it's pretty understated, but pretty pretty
he was the head of Biosite, right?
Yeah, like pretty impactful and pretty malignant and just a bad dude.
Yeah.
To me, he's a better bad guy than Sean Ambrose's character is a bad guy. The Sean Ambrose character to me feels like kind of caricature.
Yeah.
Doesn't it's just like, oh, there's this abusive bad guy. Like there's no depth to that character. There's nothing redeemable about him, in my opinion.
Feels overacted at times too. He feels overacted and like he's attempting to be a super idiot. Like in particular the scene where he's like chopping off his henchman's like fingernail, and it's just like the goal of that scene is to try and create that this is a bad dude, but it just feels like they're trying too hard on that. But we're talking, we'll get to more weaknesses in a second, but strengths. One thing I thought was, you can say it's a negative or you can say it's a positive, but it is a unique, independent feel of the film. It doesn't feel like any of the other films. So from that standpoint, there is a uniqueness element to it. It sits in a unique spot in the collection. Another one is there is a strong relational, emotional connection between Ethan and Naya. And both on a positive and negative sense. Like even when she's mad at him, you get the sense that she's mad at him because she cares, and vice versa. Yeah. And there's that tension between the two of them that I think is well done and feels good and feels legitimate from that standpoint.
So one of the best moments I think of the movie is when they're at the racetrack and he says, "Don't turn around." She turns around and stares straight at him.
Yeah,
and that really encapsulates the back and forth between them and the high level of emotion, because they're both not happy with the situation as it is and wish it could be different. But if you're really that person and you're that invested in caring about the person's well-being, like, would you really go so far as to let them do what they're doing? I don't know.
It's tough. And they do milk a lot of tension out of that. And it is a tension running storyline throughout as to the mission needs to succeed, but I don't like it. This is in here, but it's this. So it works from an emotion and tension standpoint. It's just uncomfortable and probably is supposed to be uncomfortable. I do like the opening. I think the opening is a classic Mission Impossible opening, full of action. And I like that juxtaposition where you go from plane crash to Ethan hanging out on the side of a mountain. It's like you just know, like right from the first 5 minutes, you're into it. You're into a Mission Impossible movie. That sequence probably feels most like Mission Impossible as anything in the movie does.
Mhm.
The soundtrack is really good. It's very, very early 2000s
Yeah.
soundtrack. They redid the anthem with Limp Bizkit, who was, of course, massive in the late 90s, early 2000s. Also, the appearance of a song written for the movie by Metallica,
Mm.
which I have a fun fact about that later. Uh, and of course, Sydney. I like Sydney. Sydney is a cool looking city, and it's one of the
Mhm.
first movies in the modern era to really feature Sydney.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of movies that were shot in Sydney that use it as like generic city or something like that,
Mhm.
but it really does. It features Sydney, and this is kind of I don't know if the right word is the height of Sydney, but this was the scene. This movie came out the same year the Olympics were held in
Mm.
Sydney, so this was like Sydney in its full preparation for the world to come see it in the city. So it was a
Mhm.
great time to have a movie come out set in Sydney. All right, more weaknesses.
I mean, I elucidated many of them
Yes. Mhm.
already.
Yeah.
So I think that much like Drax in the new Guardians of the Galaxy movie, Ethan Hunt in this movie definitely believes that it's not a trap when it's Face Off. Also, that's a John Woo reference to Face Off.
Uh-huh. Yep. Probably American audiences just know that as
Yeah,
his signature movie there.
but like this, I mean, the whole movie is really like spy versus spy. Like it's just guy against guy.
Yeah.
If you boil it down to
Yeah.
its bare bones, and I just like I said with the character of Sean Ambrose being so one dimensional,
Mhm.
it's really, really hard to get a lot of emotional weight or to care. Like when he dies, you're just like, okay,
Yeah.
like he was gonna die. Okay.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing like you're not like, oh no, they shouldn't have done that. Like you're rooting for him to get like destroyed, like
Mhm.
annihilated at that point. So when you have such a black and white movie like that, it's hard to be engaging, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it really struggled. I think that's my main criticism of it would
Mhm.
be that the way they wrote it, there's just not a lot to care about in the
Yeah.
movie. It may look nice, like
Mhm.
there are some cool sets. I do think they use Sydney well. I
Mhm.
think there are some very good background characters, but just when you break it down to its bare elements, I don't think
Mhm.
there's a strong enough movie there.
Yeah. I actually like a lot of the cinematography on this one, and I forgot to say this in well, no, I'll get that coming up. There's a lot of good cinematography about this. Um, the two things that people often point to why they don't like this movie, obviously the bad guy character, the mask changing, and especially the flippant way in which they do it. The other movies all have similar elements, but they manage to do it in such a way that brings the audience along. This one always felt like they're just throwing it in there. They're just thrown away. It just feels so forced and it feels so flippant, as it were. And the last thing is plot holes. There's a bunch of storylines that don't seem to connect or things that don't make a ton of sense. I mean, you can get a general sense of the story. I don't think, I mean, it's obvious they're there, but I've looked into this and I've done a lot. I've done some more research into this as to what went wrong on this film,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really fascinating. John Woo's original version of this film was 3 hours and 30 minutes.
Wow.
3 hours and 30 minutes. Uh, that doesn't work.
No.
That doesn't work at all. Also, the original cut got a rated R.
Hmm.
So they were really struggling in post production on this. They started doing on this film what they ended up doing on a lot of the other films, just better, in which they have an idea of what the action sequences are going to be, and then they write a storyline around what the action sequences are going to be. But it just really, really wasn't working on this film. And they were writing and rewriting stuff all the way up until May of 2000.
Hmm.
And they brought in another editor, Stuart Baird. They brought him in to like fix it. And you know when you're having to do major fixes in post production that it's going to be a problem. Like he cut out over 40 minutes of the movie, which is one of the reasons why it feels choppy and when you have so many plot holes is because you have to cut out so much content. So he managed to cut it out to get it to a length that made a little bit more sense. He cut out some of the violent action sequences, where that ended up allowing it to be rated R. So he cut that down so they could get a PG-13 rating. And one of the twists he did was he really emphasized the romantic attachment between Naya and Ethan. That was not nearly as prominent in Woo's original cut. So there was a lot of kind of disaster and trying to fix it at literally the last possible moment. So I think a lot of what can be termed as issues on this film have to do with all of the production issues and the fact that I think while John Woo is a good director, I don't think he had any, like, he doesn't really make PG-13 movies to that point. And he really wasn't, it seemed like he didn't know how to make the movie properly. And so then there was a lot of fixes that had to come in later. So interesting. Memorable scenes. What of the film they have, what sticks out to you as memorable?
So I actually referenced it when I talked about them meeting at the racetrack, but I think the whole racetrack sequence in general, maybe it's memorable to me because it's so understated, like it's just so normal, as opposed to the rest of the movie, which is kind of just completely off the rails. That the sleight of hand, the stealing of the stuff from Sean Ambrose character in that moment, it's more cloak and dagger spy stuff, which later movies in the series would go on to do even better. So I think you're getting kind of like a preview of some of the things that are to come in Mission Impossible. Down the road, and I think that's probably like the best written section of the movie. So for me, that's like the most memorable. Like there are a lot of scenes that I remember, but I wouldn't say that I remember them for good reasons.
No, I think you're right. From a writing standpoint, I think that scene has the strongest writing in it. The scene that stands out to me is the Seville scene when he's recruiting Naya, because I think it's the most beautifully shot scene. You have that, you have the flamenco dancers, you have the flamenco music in the background, and you have like the scene, and this is where he does a great job with the slow-mo, is it slows down. You see the flamenco dancers dress kind of filter over half the screen, and you see Ethan's face as he looks across the room, and then it pans around, and then you see Naya's face and the dress come around that side, and it's in slow motion. You see them make eye contact with each other, and then it just snaps back into the action sequence. Combine that with the sequence where she's trying to rob the necklace, and the back and forth there really established great character chemistry between the two of them right from the start. It's playful, it's fun, but there's still an action element to it, and it's lit. Like, that's what we're talking about. That's one of the scenes that has the warmest lighting in it. I just thought it was a beautifully done sequence. So that's the one that stands out to me from a visual standpoint. I like the penetrating biosite to get the viruses, that the cool lighting and really good choreography in that scene as well. So those would be the two things I think that stand out.
I mean, biosite would make a really cool laser tag level.
That's true. Anything else?
No, not really.
Okay. I just have two interesting tidbits for the facts and other things. One is the Metallica song "I Disappear" that debuted in this song. It was up until very recently, it was the only soundtrack Metallica had ever played on. And that song "I Disappear" became the flashpoint over which Metallica ended up suing Napster, which took Napster down, like the end of that whole torrent streaming thing that was going on. That was like the key moment right there with that song. And the original director of this film was originally supposed to be Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone signed on. They had one of his proteges wrote almost an entire script for the movie, and the script didn't work at all. It was crazy, and they ended up throwing it out, and Oliver Stone left the project. So you almost got an Oliver Stone directed Mission Impossible. All right, that is our wrap up of Mission Impossible 2.